Have you ever wondered if the greatest protection God could give us isn't a wall of stone, but the wisdom to work with the very forces we fear most? When a 68-year-old widow spent her entire savings planting hundreds of trees instead of building a flood wall, the whole town called her foolish. But hidden inside her late husband's forgotten journals was a remarkable idea that would stand against one of the worst floods in Kansas history. What happened next didn't just save one farm. It changed how an entire community understood nature, faith, and the quiet miracles God prepares for those willing to trust His guidance. Autumn 1993. Cold winds swept across the Missouri River Valley near Atchison, Kansas, while gray clouds drifted low above harvested fields. Meteorologists warned that record snowfall across the northern plains would likely bring severe flooding when spring arrived. Most farmers responded immediately. Bulldozers rolled across the countryside, building taller levees and stronger earth walls. Everyone believed concrete and dirt would be the only thing standing between them and disaster. Evelyn Carter watched the preparations from the porch of the old farmhouse she had recently returned to after the death of her husband. At 68 years old, she was tall and slender, standing nearly 5 feet 8, with shoulder-length silver hair tucked beneath a faded olive field hat. Her calm blue-gray eyes carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent an entire lifetime studying the land rather than fearing it. Deep but gentle wrinkles framed her face, while her weathered hands still bore the rough calluses earned during more than 35 years working as a soil conservation engineer for the United States Department of Agriculture. Throughout her career, Evelyn had restored eroded farmland, protected riverbanks, and taught struggling farmers that nature often rewarded patience more than force. She believed every landscape held its own wisdom if someone cared enough to observe it carefully. The past 3 years had changed her life forever. Her husband, Thomas Carter, had been one of the most respected hydrologists studying the Missouri River. Tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed silver hair, warm hazel eyes, and a short gray beard, Thomas possessed a calm personality that made people trust him almost immediately. While other engineers spoke confidently about controlling rivers with larger dams and stronger levees, Thomas quietly insisted that rivers could never truly be conquered. They could only be understood. Many colleagues dismissed his ideas as overly idealistic, but Evelyn always admired the way he respected nature instead of fighting it. Cancer slowly took Thomas away. During his final months, the two spent long evenings sitting together on the farmhouse porch watching the Missouri River drift peacefully beneath colorful sunsets. Sometimes they talked about birds, trees, and changing seasons. Other times they simply listened to the flowing water without saying a word. On the final evening before entering hospice care, Thomas squeezed Evelyn's hand and whispered softly, "Promise me one thing. Never stop listening to the river." Those words stayed with her long after his voice had faded. Many friends urged Evelyn to sell the farm and retire somewhere comfortable. Instead, she invested nearly every remaining dollar she owned into something no one expected. Rather than hiring contractors to build expensive flood barriers, she ordered hundreds of young willow trees, eastern cottonwood saplings, native grasses, and wetland shrubs. Every morning before sunrise, she worked alone, planting them in long sweeping curves across the floodplain instead of straight rows. Looking from above, the design appeared almost random. Neighbors stopped their trucks simply to stare. Soon the laughter began. People whispered that grief had finally clouded her judgment. At the local cafe, they joked that the old engineer had forgotten the difference between gardening and flood protection. One afternoon, a pickup truck rolled into the field. The driver, Harold Jenkins, a 72-year-old retired Army Corps hydraulic engineer, stepped out wearing a heavy denim jacket and worn leather boots. Tall, broad, with thick white eyebrows and a deeply lined face, Harold had spent 40 years designing levees across the Midwest. Practical, outspoken, and respected throughout the county, he believed engineering succeeded only through concrete, steel, and careful calculations. He looked across the curved rows of tiny trees before shaking his head. "One serious flood," he said, "will rip every one of those saplings out of the ground." Evelyn gently pressed soil around another young willow before standing. "I don't want to stop the river," she answered quietly. Harold frowned. "Then what are you trying to do?" She looked toward the slow-moving Missouri River shimmering beneath gray autumn skies. I'm trying to teach it another way to travel. Harold sighed, convinced age and loneliness had finally overcome her good judgment. Without another word, he climbed back into his truck and drove away. That evening, after planting the final sapling for the day, Evelyn entered the farmhouse and climbed into the dusty attic. Beneath old blankets rested a weathered leather tube she had not opened since Thomas's funeral. Curious, she carefully untied the worn strap and unrolled an old hydrological map drawn entirely by hand. Across the top, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, appeared a title she had never seen before: Living River Barrier. The faded map was covered with mysterious curved planting patterns, arrows tracing flood currents, and handwritten calculations unlike anything she had ever studied. For the first time, Evelyn realized the trees she had planted were not simply an act of hope. They were the beginning of a promise her husband had never lived long enough to finish. The following morning, Evelyn Carter carried the weathered leather tube downstairs and carefully opened the old cedar chest that had belonged to Thomas for decades. Dust drifted through the morning sunlight as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside rested dozens of neatly organized field journals, hand-drawn floodplain surveys, river current measurements, aerial photographs, and faded engineering sketches dating back to the early 1970s. Every notebook reflected Thomas's meticulous nature. He had recorded every observation with remarkable precision, believing that rivers revealed their secrets only to those patient enough to watch them for years instead of days. Evelyn spent hours turning page after page until she realized the mysterious map was only part of a much larger project her husband had quietly pursued throughout his career. Knowing she needed another expert's opinion, she contacted Dr. Mason Brooks at the University of Kansas. At 36 years old, Mason was among the university's youngest professors of hydrology. Tall and lean with short dark brown hair, thoughtful green eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, and a calm, analytical personality, he had earned respect for combining modern computer modeling with careful field observation. Growing up on a family farm that had been devastated by repeated floods had shaped both his career and his determination to find better ways of protecting rural communities. When Mason spread Thomas's journals across the laboratory table, silence filled the room. Hour after hour, he compared the handwritten calculations with modern flood simulations displayed on his computer. Finally, he leaned back in astonishment. Thomas wasn't trying to stop floods, he said quietly. He designed a living buffer forest that slows floodwater by dividing one powerful current into hundreds of smaller, gentler flows. Evelyn stared at the diagrams, suddenly recognizing why Thomas had always drawn curved planting lines instead of straight barriers. Mason continued searching through the journals until he uncovered several letters exchanged between Thomas and state engineers decades earlier. Although the concept showed great promise, officials had rejected it. Concrete levees were cheaper to explain, faster to construct, and politically easier to approve. Near the bottom of Thomas's final journal, Evelyn found one last handwritten message. If the river ever grows angry, don't fight its strength. Give it enough room to become calm again. She gently closed the notebook. The curved rows of young willows outside no longer looked like an experiment. They had become a promise she intended to finish. Spring arrived in 1994 with relentless rain falling across the Missouri River basin. Record snowmelt from the northern plains rushed south far faster than meteorologists had predicted, forcing the river beyond anything local residents had witnessed in decades. Day after day, emergency broadcasts warned communities to evacuate low-lying farmland. Levees that had protected towns for generations began cracking beneath the mounting pressure. Evelyn Carter stood quietly beside the first rows of young willows as muddy water crept across her fields. She felt fear like everyone else, but beneath that fear lived a fragile hope built upon Thomas's journals. Around her, the slender trees bent under the force of the current instead of resisting it. Their flexible branches swayed while dense root systems gripped the saturated soil. By the second day, disaster spread throughout the valley. One levee after another collapsed with deafening force. Entire fields disappeared beneath swirling brown water. Barns floated away, fences vanished, and tractors became trapped beneath rising floodwater. Neighbors watched helplessly as years of hard work were swept downstream. Many believed Evelyn's farm would be the next to disappear. Instead, something extraordinary unfolded. As the flood reached the curved planting belts, the rushing current began splitting apart. Rather than crashing straight across the farmland, the water slowed as thousands of willow stems, cottonwood saplings, and native grasses divided the force into countless smaller streams. Sediment settled naturally between the vegetation, while the redirected flow curved gently around the central fields before returning toward the river downstream. Nothing blocked the flood. It simply no longer had enough speed to destroy everything in its path. Several days later, the rain finally stopped. When floodwaters slowly receded, helicopters surveying the damage captured an astonishing sight. Farms throughout the valley lay buried beneath mud and debris, yet Evelyn's fields remained largely intact, covered only by a thin layer of rich silt instead of destruction. The young trees still stood, their roots holding the land together exactly as Thomas had predicted. Within a week, teams of hydrologists and environmental scientists arrived to inspect the remarkable landscape. After conducting flow measurements and soil analyses, they reached the same conclusion. Thomas Carter's living river barrier had performed far beyond anyone's expectations. For the first time, people stopped laughing at the widow who had planted trees instead of walls. News of Evelyn Carter's remarkable floodplain spread far beyond Kansas within a few months. Television crews, environmental organizations, university researchers, and government officials traveled to the Carter farm to witness the living barrier with their own eyes. What many had dismissed as an old widow's impossible dream had become one of the most discussed ecological restoration projects in the country. Scientists published studies confirming that carefully designed belts of native trees and grasses could reduce flood energy while improving soil quality and wildlife habitat at the same time. Success soon attracted powerful business interests. One afternoon, a convoy of black vehicles arrived at the farmhouse carrying executives from Titan Infrastructure Group, one of America's largest construction companies. Their president, Richard Langston, was 60 years old, tall and broad-shouldered with neatly styled silver hair, sharp gray eyes, and a composed manner developed through decades of negotiating billion-dollar projects. Intelligent and courteous, Richard believed every successful innovation should be protected, patented, and expanded through private investment. He placed a contract before Evelyn. "We're offering $50 million, he said calmly. "We'll commercialize your husband's system across the country." Evelyn quietly read every page before closing the folder. "And who will own it?" she asked. "Our company." She smiled gently and pushed the contract back. The river never belonged to one person. Neither should the solution. Instead of selling the idea, Evelyn partnered with the state of Kansas, several universities, and environmental agencies to establish the Carter Living Waters Research Center, dedicated to studying natural flood management and ecological river restoration. Thomas's journals became the foundation of the center's research library, allowing engineers, students, and conservationists to improve the system together instead of keeping it behind corporate walls. During the opening ceremony, Evelyn personally awarded the center's first scholarship to Jacob Miller. At 19, Jacob was a tall, lean young man with sandy blonde hair, kind brown eyes, and a quiet determination shaped by hardship. His family had rebuilt their small riverside home 3 separate times after devastating floods. Those painful experiences inspired him to study ecological engineering instead of leaving rural Kansas behind like many of his classmates. Looking at the scholarship certificate, Jacob promised softly, "I'll help more communities live with rivers instead of fearing them." Over the following years, hundreds of towns across America began adapting the Carter model, proving that Thomas's forgotten dream had finally become a gift shared by everyone. 20 years passed, and the Carter farm no longer resembled the quiet riverside property that neighbors had once mocked. Every spring, hundreds of thousands of students, engineers, farmers, and conservationists traveled to Atchison to study the living floodplain that had changed the way many communities viewed rivers. The young willows Evelyn had planted with her own hands had grown into a thriving forest, their roots weaving beneath the soil exactly as Thomas had once imagined. Birds nested among the branches, wildlife returned to the wetlands, and every flood season the river flowed peacefully through the natural corridors instead of destroying the surrounding farmland. Now 88 years old, Evelyn Carter moved more slowly than she once had, yet her gentle smile never faded. Her silver hair had turned completely white, and the years had deepened the lines across her face without diminishing the warmth in her blue-gray eyes. Every morning she still walked beneath the towering willows, carrying the same weathered shovel she had used to plant the very first tree. She no longer carried it because she needed to dig. She carried it as a reminder that the smallest acts of faith often grow into blessings beyond imagination. Inside the modest farmhouse, visitors noticed three objects displayed above the old stone fireplace: Thomas's handwritten journal, the original Living River barrier map, and the worn shovel whose wooden handle had become smooth after decades of faithful use. Almost every visitor eventually asked the same question: "Mrs. Carter, do you ever regret spending your life savings planting a forest?" Evelyn always smiled before answering. "I never planted a forest." She gently rested one hand upon Thomas's journal. "I believe God simply guided me to finish the promise my husband left behind." Silence usually followed. Looking through the window toward the graceful rows of towering trees, Evelyn continued softly. "The greatest things God protects are rarely made of concrete or stone. They are wisdom, patience, and hearts humble enough to learn from His creation instead of trying to conquer it." As the evening sun settled over the Missouri River, golden light filtered through thousands of gently moving leaves. Evelyn realized the greatest legacy Thomas had left behind was never a map or an engineering idea. It was teaching future generations that sometimes the strongest walls are not the ones we build against nature. They are the ones we grow alongside it. Sometimes God's greatest miracles don't arrive by stopping the storm. Sometimes they come by giving us the wisdom to grow something strong enough to endure it. Evelyn believed she was planting trees, but God was helping her plant hope for generations she would never meet. In our own lives, the smallest act of faith, patience, or kindness may become someone else's miracle one day. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith and hope. May God bless you, your family, and may His peace always guide your path. Amen.